right. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here tonight, to study the book of Judges. About a month ago, I talked with David about this lesson, and I told him I was nervous because this was going to be the first series of classes that I've ever done in a row, and he said, "You don't need to worry because we don't do classes here." So I guess everything's going to be fine. So tonight we'll start a three-part series on the book of Judges. This book of Judges is the home of characters who have shaped our heritage, filled with stories which have inspired millions around the world. When I was a child, I would find myself opening up a pew Bible during a Sunday morning lesson to read more about my favorite heroes, such as Samson and Gideon. I latched onto these stories of good men fighting for God in miraculous ways, and they quickly became some of my favorite characters in the Bible. However, as I look back on these stories of the judges, I begin to see more and more of their flaws. These judges, who I once thought of as the superheroes of the Bible, have turned out to be some of the most flawed protagonists I've ever encountered in the Old Testament. Even though a judge's main purpose in these stories was to lead the nation of Israel back to God, none of them were immune to failure. Throughout the next few weeks, I want to focus on the book of Judges and examine these characters a little closer, and hopefully we can discover that these men and women are much more than the superheroes we often make them out to be. To begin this series, I think it is crucial that we understand the history of Israel. And so tonight, that's where we're going to be for the majority of this tonight. I think it's crucial that we understand this history of God's chosen nation up until this point in time. I want to start with Abraham and the promise which was given to him. Around 400 years after the great flood, which wiped out the entire world beside Noah and his family, Abram was born, a descendant of Moses' son Shem. The Lord delivered a promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:1. "Go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." After hearing these words from God, Abram took his family out from Ur of the Chaldeans and set off towards Canaan. In his promise, God commits to building a great nation out of Abram's lineage, and more than that, God says this nation will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. We sit here tonight as a representation of this great blessing, which was bestowed upon Abraham. The whole world truly has been blessed because of the lineage which God put into place in this one man who followed God's promise and left his home country to start a new nation. At this point, I wish I could say the story is that simple, and maybe you could argue that it is. However, the scriptures we have today give us an inside look at the difficulty of keeping this promise. In chapter 15 of Genesis, Abraham struggles to rely on God's promise because he had not yet born a child to continue his lineage. But God stayed steadfast in his promise, saying in Genesis 15:5, "Now look toward the heavens and count the stars. If you are able to count them, so shall your descendants be." Abraham still decided to take matters into his own hands and had a son of his own who is named Ishmael. But this child did not receive the blessing which God had promised because Abraham was acting on his own accord rather than on God's. Finally, when Abraham was around 100 years old, to his and Sarah's astonishment both, they were blessed with a son, Isaac. And God made a covenant with Abraham, maintaining his promise with him, and they circumcised Isaac as a marking of God's chosen people. Isaac went on to have his own son, Jacob, whom God called Israel, and he became the head of the 12 tribes of Israel. Finally, it seems that the promise of God to Abraham was being fulfilled, and the Israelites were becoming a great nation. But then Jacob's most beloved son, Joseph, was sold into slavery by his own brothers, and the family was in turmoil. However, Through the power of God, Joseph became one of the great leaders of Egypt and helped his family during a great famine. It seems that the tribe of Israel had already begun to experience the multiple waves of tragedy and relief, which will become a very common theme for God's people in the Old Testament. The Israelites were fruitful and mighty during the time of Joseph, but there came a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and he became fearful of the might of God's nation. So he chose to make them slaves and servants so that they would not rise up against him. Out of this generation of slaves came Moses, a Hebrew who had grown up in Pharaoh's house. He would become the Lord's instrument to rescue the Israelites from their bondage and into freedom. This exodus did not come without its trials, but the Lord looked after his nation while they wandered the wilderness for 40 years. God began to establish laws and commandments for his people that they might understand him better. Upon entering the land which God had promised Israel, Moses was denied entry, and so Joshua led the people into the land which was sworn unto Abraham years ago. During the end of Joshua's life, he gives a wonderful history lesson of his own before the Israelites, which I've tried my best to sum up for you so far. And he follows with a plea to the nation. And I believe this plea is the best representation of the state of Israel right before the period of the judges. Joshua speaks in Joshua chapter 24, verses 14 through 28. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and do away with the gods which your fathers served beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in those lands you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The people answered back and said, Far be it from us that we would abandon the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God is he who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt, from the house of slaves, and did these great signs in our sight, and watched over us through all the way in which we went and among the peoples through whose midst we passed. The Lord drove out from before us all the peoples, even the Amorites who lived in the land. We also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. The chapter continues. Then Joshua said to the people, You will not be able to serve the Lord your God, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your wrongdoing or your sins. If you abandon the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and destroy you after he has done good to you. And the people said back to Joshua, No, but we will serve the Lord. So Joshua said to the people, You are witnesses against yourselves, that you have chosen for yourselves the Lord to serve him. And they said, We are witnesses. Now then, do away with the foreign gods which are in your midst, and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, We will serve the Lord our God and obey his voice. After all the Israelites have gone through up until this point in time, they still wish to remain faithful to God and to the promise that he will make them a great nation. Looking at the whole story, it's easy to say the Israelites were not perfect by any means. Many mistakes were made along the way to their greatness. Even the most revered leaders of Israel, such as Abraham or Moses, were prone to failing in their faith and commitment to God. But the faith of Israel far outweighed their mistakes, and they wished to fully commit themselves to God. Joshua spoke plainly about the difficulty of serving the Lord, noting that if Israel ever chose to worship a foreign god rather than the Lord their God, he would not forgive them of their sin. The Israelites answered just as plainly back to Joshua to this effect, No, perhaps we won't always be able to make the right decision, but we still choose to serve the Lord, and we will do our very best to uphold his commandments, that we may build up your great nation and live in your promised land, so that the whole world may be blessed. This is a very noble story, one which leaves me with the feeling of hope for the nation of Israel. I'm sorry. What follows the book of Joshua is the book of Judges. But before we begin to read Judges, I want to look at the outcome of this story. How well will Israel keep their covenant with God? Do they come out of this story just as noble as they began? It seems that they are in pretty good shape at the end of Joshua, seeing that they have committed themselves to remain faithful to the promise bestowed upon them. Following the book of Judges, the largest collection of stories we find is in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. The first book of Samuel begins with the story of Samuel being called to be a prophet of God, and he became well known throughout Israel as such. Samuel would go on to judge Israel all the days of his life, making annual trips around the nation and judging in those places. He went on to appoint his own sons as the next line of judges for Israel, but his sons did not lead the same way that their father led. Samuel's sons were dishonest to the Israelites, and their acts were a perversion of justice. In chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, Israel seems to have had enough of the old man and his conniving sons. In verse 5, the people tell Samuel, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the other nations." Samuel was taken aback by this suggestion, and so he prayed to the Lord for guidance. The Lord said to Samuel in chapter 8, verse 7, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also." Samuel made one last effort to convince the Israelites that electing a king for themselves would only bring turmoil and ruin. Even worse, God would not hear the cries on the day their king failed them and made them suffer. Despite his best efforts, Samuel's pleas to the nation fell on deaf ears, and the Israelites chose to have a king for themselves so that they might be like the other nations surrounding them. Hearing this story after going over the story of the Abrahamic promise, it is hard to imagine how Israel seems to have drastically turned away from their original intentions to keep the promise which was given to them. God's nation seemed to be doing pretty well during the time of Joshua. So what happened? The book of Judges holds the answer to this very question. As I mentioned in the beginning of this class, the book of Judges is often boiled down to as a story of superheroes of faith. But if that's all there is to it, how come Israel seems to be in a much worse condition after this story is finished? I believe this is because the true and main plot of the book of Judges is the degeneracy of Israel and how such a great nation, guided by the Lord himself, came to reject his promise and instead chased after worldly status. When I phrase the main plot of this book as I just did, I seem to have set myself up for failure for the next 2 Wednesdays. How can it benefit us as Christians today to study the story of a nation who slowly steps further and further away from God? I know it may seem a bit depressing, and I promise I have no intention to make this course a dreary experience, but I believe there is much to be learned from the Judges about our own history and our own future. We are thousands of years beyond the events which we have read and discussed tonight, and it can be very easy to distance ourselves from those stories. That's why I think it is important that we remember this story as our own heritage, just as much as it was a part of the Jewish heritage back then. Brother Paul, who we talked about for the last 4 Wednesdays, would also agree that we need to remember the heritage that we have come from. Paul writes in Romans chapter 11, verse 1, "I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. In verse 11, I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. Then in verse 17, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became a partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant towards the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. The story of the promise of Abraham is just as much our story as it is the Israelites. Now, the story of Judges is certainly a tragic part of this heritage, but God seems to have always been moving and working behind the curtain. Even when Israel was spiraling out of control into the darkest period of their lives, God was planning to take care of them. And in doing so, he would also take care of us today. Going back to 1 Samuel, when the Israelites finally get their way to be like the other nations, God chooses a king for them, working with them through their transgression. God chose Saul to be the first king over Israel. And after Saul, he appointed David. And we know that through the line of David, many years afterwards, a child named Jesus would be born in a manger in Bethlehem, changing the world forever. If God took care of his people all those years ago, how can we not be filled with hope and assurance today? God has proven through the ages that he does not make a promise that he cannot keep. And in that promise, we can live joyfully, knowing that we will be united with him soon, one sweet day. Paul closes Romans chapter 11 in a way that I would like to close this lesson tonight. Verse 33 of Romans chapter 11. Oh, the depth and the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor, or who has given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. May God bless this study over Judges as we look at a crucial moment in our people's heritage. Thank you.